Welcome back. Since you've now finished the first of the two author videos for this week on Petronius, you're now ready to turn to the second author video on Seneca. His full name is Lucius Annaeus Seneca, and although his works are principally philosophical, we're going to be looking at his satiric novel that is the counterpart to Petronius's satiric novel, Satyricon. His is the work called the Apocolocyntosis, which is this very strange word that means something like pumpkinification or turning an emperor into a pumpkin. It's an odd name because there is in fact no reference to a pumpkin anywhere in the novel, but that's the way that it is. So, okay, please now pause your video, go to Sakai, please open the resources and locate handout number 6, which is the one on Seneca. Please pause your video and open handout number 6. Okay, do you have that handout open? All right, then we are ready to proceed. So as you'll see for Seneca, we have quite a bit of biographical information about him because fortunately the life of the Emperor Nero, whom we made a reference to in the previous video about Petronius, is relatively well documented himself. So therefore we can trace through Seneca's bio pretty full. I will not spend a lot of time on the bio here, but you should make sure you review it on the handout so that you understand the kind of life that Seneca led. So as you can see on the handout, he was born up in Spain, somewhere between 4 BC and AD 1. Now the point here that you're noticing is that we are branching away from Italy specifically. We're now finding authors whose background comes from areas outside of Italy itself. It's been one of the effects of the developing and expanding empire that now there are quite a few more people who are literate outside of Italy proper. So therefore, their works are getting better known and probably traversing a wider parts of the empire than was previously the case under the Republic. So Seneca himself, as we mentioned, is from Spain. Spain itself was a province that took quite a bit of effort to conquer during the late Republic and the early imperial times. And in fact, it wasn't until Augustus was able to send his general Agrippa over to Spain that the entire province was finally brought together as a full unit and became known as Hispania, Hispania, the Latin word for Spain. So that's where Seneca came from. It was from a relatively wealthy equestrian family. So remember that the equestrians are the business class whose rights to society have more to do with their success with finance and business rather than any kind of family pedigree, unlike the senatorial class above them, which is in fact determined by family background. So remember that the equestrians were not especially well known or distinguished during the Republic, but they gradually, especially near the end of the Republic, came into their own, and by the time of the Empire, the equestrians were just about at an equal level in terms of status and prestige as the senatorial rank. So we know of quite a bit about his family that's detailed to you in the handout, and we know that he came to Rome at a fairly young age, where he studied philosophy and several of the major subjects in Rome. He went up to the rank of quaestor, and apparently he distinguished himself so much as both a writer and an orator that he got into trouble with Emperor Caligula. What a surprise! Caligula was not exactly a very patient, tolerant type, as you heard in the video about Caligula. So, okay. Seneca himself almost got himself executed. He was in fact actually banished, however, by Claudius in AD 41, which was shortly after Claudius came into the Principate. However, his final wife, Agrippina, influenced Claudius eventually to recall him. And Agrippina, of course, is the mother of Emperor Nero, and she's the one who's eventually going to take Seneca and Petronius both under her wing to become Nero's tutors. So Seneca had a rather rough time under the Julio-Claudian Principate line, but eventually, because he knew the right person in the right place, Agrippina, he was able to finally get himself settled into what seemed at the time to be a relatively cushy position of a direct tutor to the emperor. Now, Seneca came to befriend the Praetorian Guard in AD 51. This was still under Emperor Claudius. This is Burrus. And these two, who are both equestrians, had a marked influence on Emperor Nero. The main thing, of course, previously Claudius, and then eventually Emperor Nero, once Nero became emperor. So Seneca and Burrus ended up becoming the two principal advisors to Nero, and very likely Petronius also was in that same mix. One of the effects, however, of the tutoring of Seneca, Burrus, and probably also Petronius was that they started instructing Nero in how to conduct himself as emperor in ways that probably were contradictory to the ways that Agrippina thought that her son should conduct himself as emperor. And in fact, it appears Agrippina and Nero had a very contentious relationship, especially in regard to Nero's wife and Octavia and Nero's mistress Poppaea. That whole aspect of things did not work out well at all. So it appears that as Nero's principate continued, his relationship with his mother became increasingly strained, and it is likely that the tutoring of Seneca, Burrus, and Petronius had some effect on Nero's tendency to set his mother aside as much as possible. So Seneca, in fact, acted as a suffect consul for a time, 55-56 AD, and eventually became a senator. It was at this time that he would have observed Nero's mania beginning to come forward, because after Claudius's death, Claudius had a natural son, Britannicus, who was younger than Nero, but Claudius, probably under the influence of Agrippina, had in fact adopted Agrippina's son, so Claudius' stepson, Nero, as heir to the principate, because Nero was older than Britannicus. So Britannicus, of course, would potentially have posed a threat to Nero's position as principate, and in a fit of mania, it appears, Nero did away with Britannicus in AD 55, and we think. And then his mother followed suit, unfortunately, in AD 59, over a quarrel having to do with Nero's mistress Poppaea. Ironically, Nero killed both of his wife Octavia and eventually his mistress Poppaea as well, and the latter was in fact pregnant. As a consequence, Nero ended up with no children at all and no heirs anyplace, and because he had already murdered Claudius' only son, and because there were no other children anywhere surviving, Nero was going to prove to be the end of the Julio-Claudian line. That's something we will talk about in the video on Claudius and Nero later on. So the whole problem here is that Seneca got mixed up in this royal tangle, essentially. Once Burrus died in AD 62, Seneca's relationship with Nero himself became increasingly strained. Essentially, it appears that maybe the relationship between Nero and Agrippina might have been one of the things that got Nero closely focused on Seneca's teaching, but without Agrippina around, it's possible Seneca became increasingly disposable from Nero's standpoint, and here again, the relationships became strained. Regrettably, however, even retirement wasn't enough to save Seneca, because in AD 65, a year after the Great Fire at Rome, again, we'll discuss that in the video on Nero, Nero needed to collect as much money as possible from as many sources as possible in order to finance the rebuilding of Rome, and unfortunately, that's where Seneca's great wealth came in, and he was in fact forced into suicide. And so that's what the end of his life in AD 65. Prior to that, it appears that when Seneca was actually in retirement for those 3 relatively brief years, that he devoted quite a bit of his time to philosophical writing. I'm going to spend a brief time here talking about the philosophical writing, but I will focus most of my attention, of course, on our text, Apocalyptosis. But if Seneca continued to have any kind of relationship with Nero in the sense of writing his philosophies in order to teach or make any other kind of impression on Nero, and if it had been successful earlier, it appears that Seneca must have eventually ceased doing this later on in life. Somehow, again, despite the retirement, Seneca got implicated in either real or imagined plot to assassinate Nero, and it was that eventually that pushed Seneca to suicide in AD 65. Nero himself outlasted his tutor Seneca only for another 3 years until AD 68, when he was finally brought down in a revolution against him, started by the subsequent emperor Galba. Now, Seneca's writings are quite varied, and again, I'm going because there are so many of them, I'm going to only touch upon them very briefly. You can follow them in the handout. Many of Seneca's works are prose works that are philosophical on various ethical topics. An interesting one is Roman numeral 3 on page 2, which is called De Ira, on anger. Anger tended to be regarded with suspicion by both Greeks and Romans as a very poor means on which to plan and also to conduct oneself interactively with one's fellows. So the means of handling anger was something of great import to philosophers, and as you can see, Seneca devoted a work to it. Seneca wrote some letters also, especially the ones in consolation for various things that occurred, especially exile, and some other natural works having to do with natural phenomena and moral letters. Now, in the midst of these works, we can mention just here briefly again the Apocalyptosis, which, just like Petronius's Satyricon, is actually a Menippean satire. That means again that it's a novel written in prose, but it has poetry interspersed with it at key moments in the plot. So we will see more about that in a moment when we turn over to Apocalyptosis. The other works that can be mentioned for Seneca are his tragedies. Page 4 of the handout, you see the 6 surviving tragedies, including a Medea, quite different from Euripides' Medea, we might mention. It's a debatable point with the tragedies. There are 4 more of them on page 5. It's a debatable point with these tragedies, whether they were actually performed on stage or whether they were in fact only meant to be private works for Emperor Nero. There are reasons to believe, especially with the use of the chorus, that these actually were performed works, and they are in fact designed very similarly to the ancient Greek tragedies in this respect. And although it's possible that the principal audience was intended to be Nero, there's enough evidence with the staging and again the way the chorus works and such, ins and outs of the characters, to suggest that in fact a full production of a play was involved in the writing of these works. Essential thing about Seneca that's a little bit strange, especially with the philosophy, is the rather regrettable point that Seneca, when he wrote his philosophies, professed in many different places a need to be abstemious with one's wealth, to be as forbearing with the display of wealth, the accumulation of wealth, and so forth, as much as possible. Being modest with one's means. The difficulty with that was that Seneca was probably one of the wealthiest people in Rome. And again, so much so that, as we said before, his wealth attracted attention to Nero, when all of a sudden, after the fire, Nero's looking around, looking for wealth. Let's see, any wealthy people that he knows? Oh, yes, Seneca. So Seneca's wealth obviously cost him there. But the point is that Seneca also is sometimes thought to have been rather hypocritical, because he wrote about modesty in life, but of course he didn't actually seem to practice that in life. It's clear, though, that Seneca, as a philosophical teacher, is in fact talking about the ideal way that one in fact should live, and in fact he in fact had been during his youth a great deal more of an ascetic more of a hermit-like type. And as he became better known, especially within the Principate family, he indeed was able to accumulate wealth and kept on going with that. So it's hard to know, in fact, exactly how truthful to his philosophy Seneca actually was, but his philosophies still are considered a very important step for Roman philosophy in general, and some of his philosophies are a precursor for the great philosophical work by Marcus Aurelius, the later emperor. Okay, so Seneca, therefore, is better known, obviously, as a philosophical writer as well as a tragic playwright. But obviously, this, for the purpose of our mythological study of Rome, this is the work that, in fact, matters the most to us, the Apocalyptosis. Not only for its mythological aspect, but also for its pillorying of Emperor Claudius. We will talk more about it at a later appropriate point when we talk about Claudius, but it's appropriate here to summarize it a little bit. So as we mentioned, the work is prosometric, part poetry, part prose. It purports to be a summary, obviously mocking real historical works or biographical works like those of Suetonius and Tacitus. It purports to be a brief sum up of the death of Emperor Claudius and the subsequent trial that he underwent to determine whether he was fit for deification. This was something quite important for emperors as to whether or not they would be deified after life and worshipped as gods afterwards. If one was not deified, if one was regarded as unsatisfactory, one could theoretically suffer what happened to both Nero and Domitian, the later Flavian emperor, called damnatio memoriae, where stonecutters would go around and basically wipe out the name of the emperor in any public location in order to erase his memory as much as possible. So Emperor Claudius was obviously regarded very unfavorably by Seneca, not surprisingly, since of course Seneca had been banished by him and only recalled at the influence of Claudius's wife Agrippina. So Seneca probably had very good reason to reject Claudius and devote his favoritism to Nero. It's still, however, quite remarkably extreme, the adulation Seneca puts forward to Nero and the utter denigration of the previous emperor Claudius that he puts that emperor through. And of course, one wonders if he would have changed his tone if he had foreseen the type of treatment he would eventually receive from Emperor Nero. In any event, Seneca starts off introducing Claudius on his deathbed. He is, as Seneca puts it, speaking very loquaciously and eloquently in the part of his body down below, where he in fact can speak himself most eloquently. That's partly a jibe, obviously, on that Emperor Claudius was lame and also had tended to speak with a stutter. So Seneca, gets at that disability as quickly as possible. So Claudius passes away. Once he does, then his spirit is taken down by Hermes down first actually up to Mount Olympus in order to determine whether or not he actually could be deified. When Claudius is passing with his spirit through the streets of Rome, he notices everybody applauding and sounding rejoicing, and he thinks that everybody is celebrating his life. But what Hermes in fact tells him, I should say Mercury, is that they're celebrating the fact that he died because he had actually, according to the story, killed a lot of people or had executed a lot of people unjustly. For all sorts of false accusations. We'll touch upon that when we talk about Emperor Claudius in that video, but one of Claudius's main criticisms is that he was very devoted emotionally to jurisprudence. He liked to sit in on jury trials, but because he had a hard time hearing and also because he tended to fall asleep a lot, sometimes he would make judgment after having heard only part of the case and maybe possibly even having completely missed one side of the argument altogether. And so his capacity as a judicial practitioner was very limited, in fact, and he himself did not realize that. So, okay, Claudius goes up onto Mount Olympus. There is then discussion among the gods about exactly what should happen to Claudius. Eventually, it's the deified Augustus who steps forward before Jupiter And once again, Jupiter hears only Augustus and doesn't manage to hear anything from Claudius because Claudius can't speak clearly. So Augustus gives a denunciation of the number of false executions Claudius has carried out, among other things. And Jupiter is very quick on the spot to say, okay, let's send Claudius down to Tartarus to eternal condemnation. When Claudius gets down there, he is first convicted of rolling dice with a box that apparently has a hole in it so that he can't keep the dice long enough to actually roll the dice. That's a takeoff on the eternal punishment imposed on the Danae daughters, the daughters of Danaus, for the murders of their husbands. They're trying to fill water from one of the rivers in Hades with jars that have holes in them, and so all the water is falling out as they try to pick up the water. So Claudius is trying to roll dice with a box that's got a hole in it, and he can't hold the dice. But then, in fact, his nephew Caligula shows up, and it turns out Caligula happens to need a new law clerk, and so Claudius gets the really demeaning position of the law clerk under his nephew, the totally insane Emperor Caligula. And that's, of course, a very fit punishment for Claudius, who spent so much of his time acting as judge. Now he's going to get demoted permanently as law clerk, and he'll never have peace of mind again from his nephew Caligula. And so that appropriately takes care of Claudius. So it's an interesting work to see as an overview, and especially the way that it twists typical mythical practice in Rome, like deification of emperors, the idea of Mount Olympus, the idea of the emperors there on Mount Olympus able to testify in this council, and so forth. It's a wonderful spin on Roman myth to show that the Romans were not afraid to turn myth into something satiric when possible. Okay, so do read that work as well as Petronius' Satyricon, and come on back so we can talk about Claudius and Nero. And we will also have a video this week discussing the genres of satire and novel in general. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next video.